Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for watching our uh, panel, I guess, our conversation, our fireside chat. My name is Hailey Cooperrider, and so I'm just starting to get more involved in the sort of Holochain ecosystem. Historically, I'm an explorer of mass collaboration and decentralized collaboration. And since I heard this project brewing, I've been excited. And more recently in my career, I've gotten involved with making serious games or applied games coming from a facilitation perspective. So running tabletop workshops, basically D&D for complex problems like climate change, Dungeons and Dragons, if you don't know what D&D is. And yeah, so I've been working with Lucas and Matt and Eric and some other folks to see what we can do around games on Holochain, basically. And I'll say more about the thinking there. But the purpose of today is just to speak around all that and have a conversation with the four people here and see what emerges. And so I thought I'd throw it around for a quick um, round of similar intros if you don't know the folks on this call. So I'll throw to Lucas first.
Folks. Yeah, I came across Holochain by introduction of Hailey, and it feels full circle to have her with us in this exploration. I'm a rookie when it comes to games, but I've been fascinated with the potential of what Hailey has been uncovering. So I've been fostering and creating this new connection. I'm fascinated by collective governance and participative culture. Those are the pools that got me into Holochain. And yeah, super excited to be here with you all. Matt.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Schute, and I've been part of the Holochain team for since before it was Holochain, actually. Although I was away for a few years, and my current role involves business development, which is kind of a funny title for what I do because we don't really sell anything with Holochain, and normally business development is about the closing deals and selling stuff. Really, what I'm trying to do is to help find the places where people are facing problems. They have some kind of problem they would like to solve, and that where Holochain feels like it's an appropriate solution or could help provide a solution to those problems or pain points. And in terms of games, I was a gamer as a kid. I was actually like brutally addicted. Lots of uh, lots of times where my allowance got all gobbled up in an afternoon with Mortal Kombat, or Street Fighter 2, something like that. And eventually I decided, well, I kind of need to cut this out or I'm not going to be able to do anything else. And so I haven't been a gamer for a long time, though I have been diving into the world of gaming and game development on and off over the past decade or so. And with that, I'll pass it to Eric.
I'm Eric Harris-Braun. I'm one of the co-founders of Holochain. I'm excited about being in this panel and thinking about games and Holochain in general. Um, Probably because the whole underlying mode of thinking of what Holochain is based on, or can be thought to, you can look at it through the lens of um, how people play games together, how they start with rule sets. And if you do that, then what's possible? If we start together with a set of rules and then play by those rules, um, that is actually what a holochain application is. It's a set of rules that we can start with. And so you can think about that at all levels, from social rules, like currency systems are a social rule. Twitter is a social rule. It's a set of rules about what you can say and how long it is and who can respond to what. And there's some formalities. There's really, like, you can look at it through the rules, through the lens of gaming. And not just gaming, just actually the games we play together. Social contracts, they're a kind of game. So I'm also really excited to play to actually move this into the things that we normally call games, gaming, and keep that alive. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Great, thanks everybody. I wonder, just in case someone stumbled onto this from the games landscape, or maybe from in the wider Web3 ecosystem, Lucas, where would you send them if they're saying, what is this Holochain thing? I need to go and learn about that before I listen to the rest of this conversation.
Yes, we are gonna add this to the recording, but the website to check is holochain.org and also holo.host. Holo is the marketplace for cloud hosting of Holochain applications, the business engine behind the project. Yeah, those are the two links to check.
So, in terms of context for the panel, and I expect the conversation will escape this context, but I think there's sort of two layers to it for me. One is closer to what Eric was saying around, Holochain is something that concerns itself with questions of governance and rules and changing of rules and the social rules that we play, and games being about that as well, about being rules and changing rules and operating within an agreed rule context temporarily in order to have an experience emerge of a particular flavor. And I think we can explore that in more depth today, and that overlap between games that are more oriented towards fun and games that are more oriented towards purpose, and even what is a game and all of that. But also there's an opportunity, I think, as Holochain as being something quite new, almost esoteric in some respects, as far as a lot of people out there might be concerned, and games as an on-ramp, so more on the business development side in a sense, just awareness. There's a story that I shared with Lucas that I just listened to on YouTube. So I'm citing a YouTuber here, but that when Microsoft put solitaire on everyone's computer, it's because the mouse was new. And so it was a great way to encourage people to learn about click and drag and double click. And so, what's the equivalent of that, for teaching people about Holochain? So yeah, with that in mind, I might throw it back to you, Lucas, to take us into the meat of the conversation here. You're on mute.
What Eric just shared on the possibility of starting from a rule set and a set of agreements in evolving this as you go is one of the features of Holochain that first drew my attention. I remember meeting Matt, and he was explaining to me of this possibility of going like, hey, there's this group of people playing by this set of rules, but if a bunch of people want to go and do something else, they don't lose the history that they've been with. I feel you may tell the story much better than I do with the good images you brought back in the day, Matt.
I don't remember the images, but the basic idea being that just because we're currently playing a particular game doesn't mean we can't. Some portion of the community can't go, well, I want to try something else, and make use of the data, the history, the reputation that we've built up in that prior context. And Holochain enables that. In terms of the needs of developers and designers to boost a kind of a gaming ecosystem within the Holochain world, I'll start with one of the big stopping points actually, which is a lot of times when people are trying to figure out where am I going to build a game, they focus on where's the audience. Where's there a whole bunch of folks that are ready to pay for the game or make purchases in the game, etc. And so a lot of the gaming world is oriented towards making it easy for people to build in one form and then deploy to a bunch of different platforms, Xbox, PlayStation, etc., PC console, personal computers. So I'm kind of curious, like that for me is okay, there's a whole class of games that at least in the early days we aren't going to be the right place for. right? There are games that are like, hey, I want to build a game, like a person in their room who's got an idea and they're gonna design a thing. And then there's games that are like a Hollywood film production, you know. There's tons of money on the line. There's big teams. They work for years on end. And I think at least in the earliest days, like that's not what we're going to be chasing, you know. That is not those are not the games. The big blockbuster games aren't who are going to build first in the Holochain world. Anybody else got thoughts related to that?
Yeah, I'd like to riff on that because I've been giving this some thought as well. That in fact, it's it would be potentially strategic if you just the first thing you can do is demonstrate that it's possible, to make a game on Holochain. And so it's not necessarily necessary to create something totally new. And also recognizing that the initial audience for games on Holochain is going to be people who care about things like Holochain. There's a very large cloud of people out there who have heard about the project and sort of got excited when it started off and have bookmarked it for, okay, when there's something I can interact with, I'll check it out. There's an even bigger cloud of people who are concerned with decentralized technologies or generative technologies, platforms for mass collaboration, the broader Web3 ecosystem, who, would love to see something that actually runs, and Holochain is really close to that, I think, compared to a lot of projects. And I've heard that, I'll use this as an example. You did an early experiment with chess, with elemental chess, and so can we get chess working in a peer-to-peer platform? And to me, that's like would be an awesome starting point, is just to go, hey, let's get chess working well enough that it's on a level, with other chess experiences that people have, but just promote it to decentralization geeks and say, hey, do you already play chess online? Do you want to play chess peer to peer? Here you go. We've got it working. And that even to get to that level where it's going to be more than just trying it out because it's a cool tool, to where they actually want to play on it, requires like the expectations, like you were saying, Matt, are like for games is like a huge level of smoothness that I feel is probably higher than what people even expect in their average mobile phone app, or especially in like an app where they pay their bills, to their mobile phone provider. So even I think to get to that level, to convince people who are excited about decentralization to play chess would be like something of a focused effort, and would need a team, a small team, but a team to sustain on that for a while. But I think it would potentially be like a really worthy way to attract some initial interest to the platform. And then I'll go one step further, which is in terms of the changing the rules thing, knowing that Holochain is good at this, that if you got that part right, I think it sounds to me from what I've learned that it would not be that much harder to then go, let's make a version of chess where when you destroy an enemy piece, you also get to change a rule of the game. Or what might even be more interesting is when you lose a piece, you get the privilege to change one rule of the game of chess. And so it becomes this like flux chess or something like that. And then that might be something really distinctive that then really attracts people. So I guess that's an idea that was just floating around in my head this morning as I was thinking about this panel and walking my dog, but that maybe is a good spark for more ideas.
Something that I find it extraordinary is that in Holochain, you don't need to prepare your infrastructure to scale. So every new player that joins brings in their own bandwidth, their own processing power, and their own storage. So you're immediately set up for success in trimmed with your resources. So with an app like this one, if it succeeds, you don't need to cater for infrastructure beforehand. It does it in itself, and yeah, that's a great way to show it, eh?
I love that point. I know someone whose entire career is doing the networking layer for games, and it sounds like you get that sort of free with Holochain. Eric, you look like you've been ready to say something.
Do I have sound problems?
No, we can hear you.
There we go. Sorry. So I think one of the really interesting questions is what is really about those thresholds that you're talking about, that you were saying that what people's expectations are. And chess is a fascinating example because we actually had a very, very functional version of chess running in the Holochain quite a while ago, elemental chess that you mentioned. And so there's two aspects of that. One is the play from one person to another person and just the casual play. And then the second part is the larger social game of what's your standing. And are you running a tournament, and do you have a chess rating, and so on. And so if you're doing serious chess, then quote serious chess, then you need to have that, and that's really tricky, especially because if you're going to do stuff in competition mode, chess turns out to be almost as much of a real-time thing as a first-person shooter, because you're clicking that clock and every millisecond counts. So it's an interesting middle ground that's difficult to actually deal with. But the thing that is fascinating to me about that is the interplay between the individual competition level and sort of the greater level of how we're building together the social field for playing that game or instances of that game. And I think that's where we could do some interesting stuff. I know that one of the libraries that was built was a turn-based game library. And so reapplying that and making that available to a bunch of different games like checkers and Go, just as a space, as well as chess, as a space would be important. And yeah, I'm looking forward to actually getting that done, getting that revitalized now that we are in much more solid beta and having that stuff show up. But I had one more idea about this, about that question of solitaire that you're bringing up. What is the thing? I noticed that in the gaming world, there's a lot of games, and especially these social games, where part of what is important is territory and space. And space is a limited resource that is the thing that is enclosed. And so what you were mentioning, Lucas, is really one of the fascinating things about Holochain is that there isn't that limitation of space because it grows as you bring, or there isn't the same kind of limitation of space. So I'm curious to see what would be the game in what would be the gaming space where as more people come, more space is brought to the game. It's kind of like Minecraft, where as you come, your presence increases the space. And I'm a little bit hesitant to only have that be physical space because there's so many other types of spaces that exist. But I'm curious what we could do with that in gaming, in the gaming world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that makes me think about when you're designing a game experience, you're trying to create some sort of tension, that kind of hooks people in so they can get into a sort of flow, because if it's too easy, then it's boring, or maybe it's just pure exploration. There was a game called No Man's Sky that was it was all about procedural generation of an entire galactic star system. And there were thousands of procedurally generated planets that you could go and explore. But in terms of what you actually did, there wasn't a whole lot. And they kind of kept at it over the course of a few years, and they've started to grow their user base from the initial people who are happy just exploring this procedurally generated universe to add in some mini games of capturing animals that you take photos of, and I think some combat and some stuff like that. So you need some sort of tension, and if the world keeps expanding, the tension also needs to expand. The sort of what is the core dilemma that makes it a game, that makes it some sort of playful struggle. But yeah, I had similar thoughts when we started this conversation. You might remember, Lucas, of like, I'd love to see a game, even thinking about the sort of team building context that I sometimes work in, where if people are on their lunch break and 3 people start playing, it's no problem if 7 more people show up 30 minutes in. The game just expands its space, but also the sort of level of sort of struggle or tension to engage those people, or gives them something to do. So that pattern you're bringing, I feel like, can solve multiple problems in a sense, like a sort of a fluidity of accessibility to the shared experience, something like that.
So one other game that we built in the early rounds was and I also want this one to show back up again, and I'm curious about how we can add to the tension, is a version of Reddit Place. Are you all familiar with Reddit Place and what happened? And so that's a fascinating game where you have the tension of competing in a very small limited space, 1,000 by 1,000 grid of changing pixels. And it is interesting to think about what happens when a new person comes in if you were to add space there. But there is that is an interesting kind of tension to a limitation in space. I don't know exactly how it would play with this, but doing that in Holochain was interesting to me in that, well, I mean, I think this is the other whole side, that what's interesting about Holochain, that I'm really curious to explore into. What are the games that prove out in this space is the one where there is the deployment question is really different. The deployment is instantaneous. It doesn't take provisioning on Amazon. It doesn't take your local server. The provisioning happens because you just come to it, which is not the same question of adding space. It's there's a provisioning difference. So I'm not quite sure how that ties into where we're going, but it seems like a crucial piece to be have in the mix.
Could maybe frame a new question based on that, because that was an interesting point. But just quickly, I think the space that was added when a new person that came to place was that it was a new vote, if I understand correctly. Like they can change a pixel. It was like once a day, 1 pixel a day, or once every 12 minutes or something.
Yeah.
So there's more space that person brought in terms of their ability to change a pixel, and then whatever team they sort of aligned with, emergent team, got more space in that sense. But yeah, I wonder if, concerning ourselves with this question of how might games be a way in which Holochain begins to thrive and have more people become interested and involved in using it, and getting that beautiful feedback loop of creating value for people responding with, things that we can learn from and improving the platform. If we look at the instant provisioning as like a crucial advantage, what kinds of games or experiences, gameful experiences, would benefit the most from that, and therefore we should encourage the most, in the development of in the ecosystem?
Something that is occurring to me is, how do we distinguish the game logic and fun and what game engines do? So I think that Holochain is specifically good for specific game engines. So we have a collaboration engine called Syn that allows people to do things at the same time on a peer-to-peer platform. That there is the provisioning thing. So what are the little engines like a turn-based game engine, or a graphic design engine that we can use to block create a diversity of adventures or possibilities?
I should point out that in the game development world, there's a specific meaning when people talk about game engines. So, and things like Unity are game engines that enable folks to build games for various platforms. One of the ones that was exciting for me was Godot, which is an open source game engine. But that's a little different from, I think, the layer of kind of application modules that you're referring to, Lucas.
Yeah, it's funny
And
because
also, I'd maybe introduce the term mechanics, which is taking turns is the mechanic, or area control, or having area at all in your game. And then the combination of mechanics then creates dynamics between players, you know, in terms of their response of feeling a win or wanting revenge, or, you know, those kinds of things. So those might be useful kind of layers. Yeah, but I agree, it would be helpful, I think, to maintain the word engine for the technologies that allow game development. So
Well,
to
and-
put
and
the
tip-
question again, like what engines and what supporting technologies and even also cultural elements do we have that what kind of games are we best sort of set up to create that then meets a desire of people to play? But
So
right.
I got one for you that I'd love to hear you riff on, Hailey, which is what happens when you take something like Pokemon Go or Ingress, which are go out into the world games, and you mix that with Holochain, where the limitation is not that somebody pre-thought of that game and of what's available. It's not being serviced by and both of them come from the same company. What's their name? Anybody remember? The something labs. Google bought them for a while, but they ended up thinking about it, and they're provisioning the scarce resources of the portals that you capture in Ingress, or the Pokemon that pop out in the world. What happens when that becomes self-sourced? And in a sense, what you do is we give ourselves the capacity to create game resources in the world because we're doing that, and we add in the space. It feels to me like that would be a really interesting, like it's not really augmented reality, might be augmented reality. Like it doesn't have to be because you put your phone up and you see the Pokemon, but the fact that you're actually out in the world and you have a space for having a collaborative game in the world, maybe a really, and the fact that it can be sourced by the peer-to-peer users of it, seems to me like maybe a really interesting and significant place to add in these other things, the social rules or the social patternings around that. What would be the grammatics of doing that would be easy to spin up for game designers who want to do that and don't need to have large server sets to make that kind of thing work?
Yeah, that company was named Niantic.
That's right.
And a couple months ago, when I was at the Game Developer Conference, I had a chance to have a few different conversations actually with two of their team members. One that was, I think, leading product stuff on some items, and another person. Both were really interesting, but we actually had a conversation along these lines. And I was asking if they had any guidance in terms of Pokemon Go like experiences, but where people actually had real world problems they were trying to solve, and that other people were trying to help them solve. And they actually pointed out that that particular thing was kind of difficult to make a game, because as soon as you can see like oh wow, I'm solving somebody else's actual need, it's very tempting for that to get pulled into economic type patterns of interaction as opposed to play type patterns of interaction. So it's, you know, even if it's just, hey, who knows a good place to find a haircut around here, you know, that kind of thing can very quickly morph into a different sort of social space. The other,
I think that, yeah, that's spot on. And the question of stakes as well. If you're trying to bring it, so the stakes are essentially zero in a game. It's almost like a ghost of stakes. Like you feel the risk and you feel the reward or you feel the disappointment, but because it's a game, there's this part of your brain that knows and feels cruisy and comfortable to be able to go like, okay, well, whatever, just try again, reset back. I get to take another run at this. As soon as it becomes at all real, the stakes just, it's not even a question of sort of quantitative. It's a total paradigm shift into oh, this matters, you know, and I could get in trouble, or I could be exploited, or I could be missing out on an economic opportunity, or I could be getting paid. And so really, you can take something that people are already doing and try to make it more gameful or gamify it, which if we use that term strictly, sort of to me means put fake rewards on it that aren't meaningful in order to sort of psychologically manipulate people into doing something they don't want to do.
Exactly.
Or you can make it more gameful, which might be a more positive way of saying, well, I'm going to bring more story or more expressivity or just some fun to this, or a fictional layer that kind of assists me in doing something I already want to do. Yeah, but I guess working in this sort of applied gaming space, I think it tends to be you tend to be more already in something that people already do, and just bringing useful components from games to sort of elevate that.
Related to that, I want to open up a couple of lines of inquiry that are kind of touching on this, which is, hey, in order to play those kinds of games realistically, Holochain needs to be working on mobile, well on mobile, and at present, today, Holochain doesn't yet work on mobile, at least not well. Though some folks in the ecosystem are trying, or starting to explore those. Some of the ways in which we've talked about having Holochain work on mobile involve the mobile phones not have a lot of responsibility, which in my mind means, oh, you might actually have a lopsided scaling. The stuff that we were talking about earlier of, hey, we're as more users come, then there's more capacity. That might scale differently. And so I just kind of want to open up for conversation around those areas.
So just to play it back so I understand the limitation you're talking about, that one of the solutions for how we deploy Holochain on mobile phones is, well, maybe we just ask less of the phones in terms of resourcing the connection. Okay, cool.
Yeah, less responsibility for storing, validating, and serving content as a peer in the network, including, possibly zero. So they're operating kind of like they do today in most mobile apps, right? They're just a client, with the exception that they're able to kind of author things into the space. So they are recording their own content locally, but they're not having to store and validate and serve other people's content. But when they're doing those things, there's copies of their stuff that's being made by others. And so they are imposing additional burden on the network without bringing capacity themselves. And that's a particular architecture. It's just one of many possibilities, but it results in a slightly different dynamic, and there may be other things needed for trying to make that not go lopsided, I think, for a particular community or group of users.
That's interesting because that's just true that one of the things you don't want to do is incur people costs, and there's bandwidth costs when you're on your phone. You might hit your max, and even if you're on a free Mac unlimited plan, usually what that ends up meaning is, well, after a certain amount, you get throttled on the mobile platforms, and so that's one of the places where Holochain has some limitations, because you have that cost that you want to prevent people from incurring. And so in those cases, the phone's use of the gossiping in the network, you want to do exactly what Matt was saying. But what that reminds me of is in Second Life, I remember when you turned your computer off, if you went and you looked at somebody whose computer off, there was the person sleeping. So what, right? I don't know if you all remember that from Second Life. You could just see them there like snoozing away. And I think maybe something like that happens also in Minecraft. So there are interesting ways in which these realities can become part of whatever gaming dynamic you have.
I wanted to respond to what you're also open that thread around sort of peer-to-peer co-creation of the landscape. I think a sort of frame for it is in playing that game, and this relates to the sort of seriousness versus low stakes, high stakes. Is encountering the Pokemon sitting in the tree branch. That's a moment of delight. It's like, oh, there it is. And it looks like Pokemon that I'm familiar with, and it moves a little bit, and then I can capture it, and it goes ding, and I get the reward. and creating and crafting that kind of experience is an artistic endeavor. And so I know Second Life has marketplaces where people create clothing and furniture and stuff, and those people sell that internally. Second Life has one of the most successful and long-lasting in-game monetary ecosystems. In the history, it's like people forget it still exists, and it's still pretty big, and it's so much stuff that people still struggle to do these days. Second Life has been doing for decades. Um, where am I going with this? In that I think you just need to have that sense of, well, in platform theory, talking about two-sided platforms, this theory of people who produce and people who consume content, and just understanding that they have different needs and different motivations. And so, yeah, I guess with the example of real world needs, everyone has real world needs. And if you make it easy for people to upload them, that's one thing. But for trying to get someone to create experiences or content, there's more input required for those people, or more incentive, I suppose.
Something that is coming to me is that in Holochain, the user, the agent, has much more say on what is shared with whom. So in a platform like Pokemon Go, you could establish who would have access to the videos you shot, to the maps that were created around the territory you were exploring. So it changes the business logic, because it allows the player to restrict the extraction of data. That is one of the business models out there, but it's a very predatory business model. So in Holochain, we're going to experience this innovation of, oh, what are the business models that are not extractivist, and that will enable this experience of games like Pokemon Go, that will capture maps and will have videos of sceneries, and how will this be used with consent? And I'm really interested in this culture of consent, where it's not the colonizer experience we've always had. So if you're not shooting everyone, what is it that you're doing that's fun? So I'm really excited to see what will emerge with this.
The co-creator thing. Oh, I'll briefly share this. The co-creator point, meaning like individuals making artifacts, the artists, that side of this, is interesting in that it tends to sit within an environment, a platform that is usually developed in the way we were talking about earlier. Hollywood style production, very hierarchical organization, a lot of capital that goes into the creating of this initial space, and then once that has a user base, then maybe the opening of space for other people, for there to be other economies that involve a lot more peer production, or prosumer kind of production.
I think
Agree.
actually this underlying thing that you're getting at, Hailey, about the co-production or co-creation, it seems like this is probably one of the better places for us to go looking. And what I'm thinking about is the layers, like not thinking about it the way you just said, Matt, which is true. This is the way the world operates, that there's the people who make the world and then the people who go play in the world. So what about a whole stack of layers of creation that we're all available to be part of, and that the game can hold that? So, I mean, one of the examples is this game that I shared, that I built out, which is a game for building text adventure games. And you can go and build the text adventure, the rooms, you can add in new rooms, you can add the descriptions and create the links on them. And that's half of the game, or maybe 99% of the game, I don't know. But at the same time, then you can flip into the mode where you type go north, look and see the stuff. But that's just 2 layers. how can we think about a whole stack of the layers of the sandbox style games, the Minecrafts where people love building the games and then they like playing games inside the world they built, but who gets to add new things into the game? New types of things that can exist in the game. I think that's a super hard problem to actually have that stack of grammars at all the different levels that can be used and played with. At DWeb, I met Philip, I think Newcomb, the founder of Rosedale, yeah, founder of Second Life, and we had some interesting discussions about things they did not want to put in the game. Like I think he was really worried about putting in coding into the game at all, because that would create two classes of people: the coders who created that stuff, and then everybody else. And so there's class dynamics that happen when you have powerful grammars that allow you to create things inside games that have long learning curves. And it's a really interesting thing to try to figure out. Like, what is literacy at these different levels in game spaces if you have the actual affordances to write, to be literate at any of these different levels?
That's so interesting. And that becomes, I think that brings us back into the governance space and the culture space. It's the coders didn't disappear from Second Life. They just became part of a priesthood, essentially, a very highly managed place where you're trusting, in a sense, the benevolent dictators, to use open source software kind of perspective, of the people who own and run the company, the Lindens, right, to make those calls, in a way, to be King Solomon, and um, to make philosophical judgments about how it should be, right? And I wonder if the opportunity then in Holochain is to say, we can do this through co-governance and culture, and leave that composability and that access to composability at the lower levels in place, and reap the benefits of that because we trust ourselves to govern it together.
Yeah, that is a beautiful phrasing. And it also means that we trust that we're going to be okay when there's fracturing that creates less coherence, because that probably will happen, right? The beautiful thing about having it owned and captured is that owning and that capture can create lots of very nice coherence, which we love.
Correct.
And this is what Apple provides for us: a lot of really nice coherence around design. And we also pay the cost.
Yeah, I'm super excited with how are we going to walk the talk of conflict resolution, in co-creation, in coming into agreement on what are the basic rules of thought. Because like Holochain creates all of this extraordinary collective coordination framework. In now that it's ready, we are being called to bring social practices into it. So to use the technological infrastructure to experiment with it, and where are we going to drink from those experiments? What are the communities of practice? Who's doing it? How to make that fun? It's like I've been sitting with this idea that governance is like doing the dishes. You don't invite people over to your home to do the dishes, right? You invite them for a feast, and then you cook together and you have fun, and then you do the dishes. It was said from neighborhoods that brought my attention to it that I love governance. I love doing the dishes, but I can't invite people to come home do the dishes, right? it has to have a party beforehand. And I feel that games is beautiful for that because it's a feast, right? It's a passion. It's fun. So, and then the bits of coordination and conflict resolution can come pulled by the need rather than on a push.
I'm feeling something snap together mentally that I think connects those dots a little bit to your previous point, Eric, and what you were just saying, Lucas, around layers. I might just go on a bit of a riff because, like you said, what's it, Realms of Ludos? multiplayer text dungeon game where there's the kind of creating of the rooms and there's the experiencing of the rooms. When I think of sort of casual players who aren't interested in doing the dishes of governance and that whole layer, and they're also not that interested in playing around with technologies that aren't quite delightful yet, that are like, or maybe they don't have a relationship to old text adventures, because they're not of our age group. That having the ability to build then a visual layer and someone to come along and say, I really love this room. I'd love to compose, a Minecraft level visual space. And there's potentially even an editor about dropping in different assets, just like games are. And we can see that. And it's not easy, but also I've seen a lot of people cook up stuff like that, and, Notch made Minecraft on his own initially. And so you can imagine that, but I also love that if you almost had it as a rule, like a constraint, a principle of Realms of Ludos, that you have to have the text layer, that also makes it more accessible, right? It makes it accessible to site limited people. And it's like, having the clean, it's like when people who I met a professor who said, I still use Pine, right? Which is the ancient kind of email thing. And people put all this HTML in emails, and you should always have a non-HTML version, like that kind of level of building also gets you that accessibility and that graceful sort of devolving to older platforms or to lighter platforms. But also then I guess the more stacks, the sort of more complex stacks that you built on top of this kind of core concept of a room, the more that changing the core concept of the room becomes a big deal. And so then we kind of get this interesting governance play about who gets to change the room and like what level you're at. And one of the concepts what Eric and I talked about when we were sort of workshopping Realms of Ludos was, what if the default experience is to not start in the dreaming of building the space, but is to start in the space, and until you've navigated a few rooms and found the item, the pillow, the magic pillow or whatever that brings you into the dreaming, then you don't open up that part of the game. And that's something that games often do, right? Is they start with one experience and then they open up more layers as you go. Lucas.
Hailey, you just clicked a spark for me because earlier on, Matthew and I were talking about the agent centricity in Holochain, how there are membranes that are connected by the people. So there's a possibility of playing with grammars that is pretty unique. So yeah.
I mean, you saying agent centricity made me think, well, couldn't an agent always fork a room that they get into and go, oh, I don't have permission to edit this, but I'm going to make my own parallel one. And then maybe that's actually another layer that people access is look at other dreamers' versions of this room, like moving into sort of like there's a game Psychonauts where as part of the game, you go into people's minds and explore. It's a 3D action platformer, but you sort of explore their particular world and their trauma and as a 3D action platform. As a theme. Yeah, it's beautiful. And they released actually a 32-hour long documentary about the production process of the sequel. And just like, if you want to understand a game studio, I can't recommend a better video to watch. But just, yeah, made me think about you could have different rooms or the same room as cloned by, and you can sort of swap between those lenses of different agents.
And this can give an extraordinary flavor of what the possibilities of agent centricity on embodied way, right? It's not theoretical. Yeah, I loved it.
Well, okay, so since you're bringing in agent centricity, I got to bring in the other follow-up here that might, or to me, the other half. See, people think about Holochain as agent-centric, but to me, that's only half of Holochain. Holochain starts with empowered agency, but it requires sociocentricity, which is that all of those agents agree to play the same game together, which is to be in society, in sociality. And so for me, and the empowerment of the agency is that you are never locked in to one game. You can't be held hostage because at least to the data that you yourself have created, to the moves in the game that you've played, and those with whom you're associating, the ones or the subset of them. That's where there's empowered agency in the context of sociality. And so just like, I really appreciate, Hailey, what you're saying there about having all of the different people's versions of the rooms that are held there, because then that might bring forward this combination of agent centricity and sociocentricity that, to me, if they're really combined well, it stops being a dilemma of the group versus the individual, or the individual versus the group, and it starts being a synthesis of the group and the individual, which is actually what good games are anyways, right? So
Yeah,
Yeah, you made me want to go on the whole Cars infinite and finite games, and that whole thing where for finite games which have a clear ending and potentially a clear winner, the players need to agree to temporarily subscribe to that set of rules. And as soon as someone stops doing that, it kind of stops being the game. It's something else. If they start cheating, it's kind of moved into that larger context of just people in the world. Unless, of course, the cheating gets reincorporated, it's just understood.
yeah.
But also that point about the sociality and the agent centricity, that I had this moment of imagining then people going, "Oh, I really like what you did in that room. Can I have that asset, or can I grab that piece of it? Or hey, can we merge our ideas back, or can we take all these ideas?" And those 5 people doing, we had a fork and now we're having a merge, and they're almost practicing open source culture. I know when the open source movement was really kind of gaining steam in the sort of mid 2000s, it's like, we have the way of culture in the world, and forking and merging is the way of the future. And it's nice to imagine a gameful way in which that could happen.
I've been
I feel, Lucas, go ahead.
Yeah, I've been extremely co-opted by the participative culture and deliberation democracy experiments in Taiwan, in how they are bringing participation really early on, so listening at scale and creating early on panels for decision making. And they're really interested in gamifying it and making participation fun. So this realm of how do we start with joy? How do we start with passion? And enable experimentation and innovation on a joyful way. Like, yeah, that really talks to me. I'm very inexperienced in it, but I remember you giving me your card the other day, Hailey, and it was like, oh, it's not a regular business card; it's a game. And we were engaging with that very mundane experience of, hey, here's my business card in case you need my contacts. And oh, by the way, I'm a game designer and my business card is a game. Do you want to play? So we were engaging on a very yeah it sort of removes distracting layers. I feel joy has this ability to remove what's not essential. You go straight into the core.
What that brings up for me, Lucas, is that in the case of governance, deciding questions of policy like they're doing in Taiwan, it's a question of survival or thrival or thrivability, but it's a question of our life. And so there's also sadness and anger and fear and grief and all these other emotions that are involved in the governance process. And so those can be gameful. But I think if you're only focusing on how do we bring joy to it, that starts to stray into that putting chocolate on the broccoli to make it editable. But if you were to understand where all the emotions happen throughout participating in governance, I think part of a reason why someone might not want to step into that is, besides time limitation, and just their questions of survival, is the depth of the concerns and what you're really facing into when you do that. So I don't have an answer for that, but that's just what strikes me when you say we need to bring more joy in order to make people participate more in governance. Like, well, makes me sad.
I participated in a game design workshop at the Game Developer Conference a few months ago, and it was a really interesting workshop, and it was about designing games that put players that created tension, essentially. And we sort of had a task set before us of getting players to do things that were uncomfortable, like where they were, or getting players to a point where they're playing the game and they're wanting to rebel against the rules of the game, or they do start rebelling against the rules of the game. And my group actually designed a game that a person came, our tester or whatever, came over to play and then decided, nope, don't want to play. Like after having the game described, was like, nope, that sounds way too like traumatizing an experience. I don't want to play. It was a really interesting, like it was a couple of day workshop that I got to participate in, part of each day basically. And yeah, the breadth of what it can mean to play together, and what kinds of emotional experiences or shared experiences a game designer is creating is much broader than just we, to Hailey's point. And especially when we start coming back into those kind of co-creative world concepts, it's interesting to think of how rich those might get, or how bland, if there isn't that, if there aren't, to the infinite and finite and infinite games point, if there aren't subspaces that do have some kind of coherent authorship, it'll be difficult for people to actually be able to step into spaces that generate different kinds of feels. And then I want to say one last thing that's kind of related to this, and it was something that Hailey had also shared about earlier, which is this concept of people being able to change the rules. It's one of the things I'm most excited about. I really am excited about people being able to change the rules of the games, both because I think it's just an interesting thing. Like, I think tic-tac-toe is a pretty boring game. I think tic-tac-toe, where you can change the rules in various ways, becomes a much more interesting game, because you can make it so that it's no longer just a default, hey, we can always tie. There may be other things.
Yeah, what if you're going to lose, or it's going to go to a tie, instead of taking your turn, you could expand the number of spaces.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, like, the thing that I'm excited about there isn't so much, oh, I think it'll be a more fun game. I'm excited about people having the experience of changing the rules. Like, my belief is, it doesn't take long of getting to change the rules, play the game again with the new rules, go, wow, that was a very different experience. It doesn't take too many times of doing that before you start going, well, what else can we change the rules in? Like, how else might we be able to redesign the rules by which we play all of our social games? And for me, that's both a technical thing. Oh, that's how you do it, but much more importantly, a permission thing, because I think that most people don't give themselves the permission to go and start fiddling around at that layer, and I'm excited to see what happens when they do. Chaotic neutral, chaotic good. I don't know.
I could speak to as an example of emotionality and its relationship to agency, and that question of feeling increasing the agency to do something through a game that we've been doing with local governments here in Australia, where I live, near Melbourne. And so, climate resilience is a strong question here. How do we get local communities to be more engaged with preparing for the increasing rate of disasters, as well as just generally being more able to sort of mutually bail each other out, because the government will be limited in how many people it can sort of bail out in a crisis. And eventually, hopefully, leading to mitigation. But it's called the adaptation game because it's focused more on how do we adapt rather than how do we sort of reverse the climate crisis, which we all agree would be nice. But right now, disasters are getting faster. And the game doesn't seek to convince anyone who disbelieves. It's sort of more for people who we call the persuadables, who know that they need to be doing something, but they feel paralyzed. And when we talk to them, they have this, it's fear is the primary emotion. It's this disempowering giant narrative that climate change is going to change everything about the way we live. It's just going to be really bad. So I can't even begin to start thinking about what I ought to do about it. And it's very global. The problem is this global thing, and all of the ice is going to fall into the ocean, and it's going to be bad. And so what we do is we create a co-imaginative space, sort of in the Dungeons and Dragons model at the tabletop, where we put a map down of literally their neighborhood, their local area that they live in, ask them to kind of create themselves as a character in an alternate reality of their actual neighborhood. So it does shift into that game space where it changes the stakes because it is fictional, even though it is factual. And then we, at the start of the game, re-invoke the fear through reading news and that global, all these things are happening and that's bad, and kind of bring people into that place where they kind of live. But then we move them into empowering them to do things. So they have energy to spend on making adaptations, starting a WhatsApp group with my neighbors, putting solar panels on my house, having food in the pantry, going and getting some education about X, joining the volunteer emergency response group. And then after they've done that, we then introduce a shock, which could be a flood or a heat wave or a bushfire, but one that is specific to their neighborhood. So it's not this global doom that's coming somewhere down the pipe. It's something that probably has happened in the last 10 years, and it's just going to happen with increasing rate, but it comes to their neighborhood. And they just go through 3 or 4 cycles of preparing, and then how did your preparations help you respond? What trouble did that create for you? We give them these trouble cards that can create quite an emotional experience of having to, deal with a problem or sacrifice something. But by moving through that and rehearsing that imaginatively, they move from the big undifferentiated ball of fear and doom to specific fears that are actionable. And there's all this energy that's now freed up because they're no longer holding the big ball. They've got these actionable little balls of fear to actually do things. So when we interview them 6 months later, they have taken that action. They've joined that group, or they've gotten solar panels on their house, or decided not to get a new 3rd dog when the current one passes away. Big and small changes, but things that are meaningful. And so I guess I'm offering that as a way to show how emotional interplay works. But also this is a connection of people to governance, because in the game we also simulate what are the local programs that local council is starting to roll out over the coming years. And we get them to vote in the game in terms of which ones they would like to see. Because it is fictionally related to their survival, then suddenly they're a lot more engaged in those ideas, and council can kind of peek into the game and go, how are people thinking about these things? Just to tie some threads together and something we're actually doing.
I think there's something really powerful about that. I really appreciate the insight about creating action through removing stakes. Oftentimes we think that the way you need to get to action is by upping the stakes. But what I hear you saying is, no, you can create action and engagement by lowering the stakes, which makes a lot of sense because that's about safety. And so you can remove.
Well, and just to clarify too, it's that it allows them to rehearse imaginatively doing something, which then makes it easier to actually do something.
Yeah.
Something
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
please. No. I didn't notice you were adding
I
the.
I was going to switch to maybe a slightly different topic, but it's being triggered by the notion of emotions and what emotions are engaged by the gaming space. There's this one game, an arcade game from my childhood. Do you guys remember Quix, QIX? Is that a game that anybody remembers? So it's this very odd game. It's totally abstract, in which the thing that you are is this little spark that draws a line, and you go out into space and you enclose space, and then it changes color. And then there's this swirling bar that's dangerous, and if it touches you while you're going out into space before you've come back in enclosed space, then you die and you go on. And this game was one of my favorite games, and not so much for any reason other than it was beautiful. And so I'm really curious about the experience of beauty and abstract beauty, and what we do in game space to make that happen. The other one that was like that is Tempest. It was also a very abstract game, just vector drawing, and it's a shooting game, but also the things were beautiful inside a very limited palette of color and lines. And so I'm really, and then the last thing was I played a game recently. It was called Don't Die Together. Do you know this game? It's like try not to, you just play until you die, and it's wilderness survival. But this is one where you play with somebody else at the same time. And I remember in playing this game, you get into winter and you're losing food and you don't eat enough. And then all of a sudden, like, you start having visions and you see things coming out of the dark that you don't know what they are. And I remember in this, Don't Starve Together. Yeah, thank you, Matthew. That's what it is, not Don't Die Together. I remember having this actual feeling of fear and horror because of what was happening as the winter was coming on. And I was quite impressed that the game was able to evoke that emotion in a really guttural way. And it did so visually, and because of the music, and because of the just like, oh no, I'm gonna starve. And so that's kind of the opposite of beauty. It's kind of like ugliness that the game was able to create. And I mean, I don't know how this relates to Holochain, but I'm really attracted to that.
It's
Yeah,
the
the thing
sublime.
that's coming to me. Sorry, Hailey, please.
I was just saying that the alternative beauty is the sublime. Seeing the storm from the mountaintop,
Yeah.
which is a concept I've always enjoyed. Go ahead, Lucas.
There's something quintessential, right, on extreme emotions. Yeah. Something that's coming to me is that games have this capacity of transposing you from a comfortable, privileged center position into the periphery, into the edges. You can identify with minorities, with extreme situations. It is in the periphery, it's in the edges that innovation arises. So this capacity of games of transposing you into those emotional spaces can be exceptional uh, uh, on the play space, right? I'm remembering this game that is described in a book I just read called Tomorrow, Tomorrow, Tomorrow. So there's this game designer, and she's in a class, and she designs this game where if you're playing to win, you will have little information. So you're in this assembly space where if you commit points to knowing what is it that the assembly is doing, you tend to lose the game. So if you're very result oriented, you will just keep assembling and gaining points, and you will win. But if you commit some of your points into knowing what is the assembly is doing, you find out that you're actually working on a factory for a fascist government, for Nazis. So if you don't get the information, you win, and you get this badge of the best Nazi collaborator. So you win, but you lose. So there's this playful way of dealing with that experience of what it was to be embedded in a war collaborative culture. And so yeah, I'm fascinated by those possibilities of playing with edge emotions on a safe space, right? You don't need to be truly risking your skin, but you can tap into that innovative experience.
The game design workshop that I mentioned earlier was basically one of the workshops actually involved groups picking a game that they enjoyed and then selecting an emotion from that game and trying to then design a paper tabletop version of that game that would enable players to experience the emotion that they had identified, which was great because it showed off this wide range of emotions, like we've been talking about here, that people were able to create experiences with very simple, cards, pens, writing, etc., some rules, and you really did have people feeling horrified or feeling scared or feeling that excitement and anticipation or whatever the thing, or feeling creative, whatever that thing was that they were chasing, and they were using the MDA, mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework. And the big point of this workshop was you can create really rich experiences for people that don't have all of the bells and whistles of one of these big production games. The emotional experiences you can generate that with very little of all the other stuff. And for folks who were in that room who weren't like me, people who spend their lives actually working on these games, whether they're like big shot producer or somebody in the trenches actually doing the, like, I don't know, the art for a character or whatever.
Designing a sword for 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. Right. This is like the wonderful reminder that they get to go participate in every year, that like, oh no, this is what it's about at the end of the day. Like, this is what really like matters and sinks home. And for me, that's really heartening because it says, oh yeah, people are going to be able to design really compelling experiences even early on in Holochain, um, without needing to put the millions of dollars in the whole, large teams of people, in order to make that happen.
If I can grab that, I think that's a really powerful segue because I also need to wrap up. But to, in a sense, the question that I've been really concerned with, which is, where do we start? And one of the theories of running the Holochain Game Incubator event was going, well, where's the energy already in the system? And that's one of the drivers that I think should steer us, is what are people already excited about? And I think this panel, in a sense, was another driver, was some sense making about, well, where does the opportunity lie? What are the affordances that Holochain particularly provides? What is the culture excited about? What is it that we really want to bring to the world? It's sort of an ikigai kind of an exploration. And I guess I wonder, with all that context loaded up for all four of us, for each of us to kind of go, what would we recommend to people who are excited, or what do we think we'd work on if we were going to work on something? I think there's still, for me, just that, I guess that I'll kick off with just my sort of closing thought is just the importance of shipping something, that people want to play, and just go, what's the smallest possible game that will at least get people go, oh, this is possible, like this can happen. And that's, I think, why I was hitting on chess before. And, maybe it's chess where you can change the rules, or maybe when you said tic-tac-toe, that's something you can, someone could probably hack together in an afternoon. And then tic-tac-toe that has a set of optional rules changes where your move can be a rules change, but they're already built in. They're curated as delightful things that we know will work, will create an interesting experience. And then that can create a secondary kind of prosumer, co-creator kind of layer of people who can add possible rules changes for more casual players to select from, that kind of thing. So that's what I'm with my searchlight, looking out for, to kind of go, hey, like, let's swarm on something like that, or let's support someone who's ready to do that, and why Eric's game Realms of Ludos is also really exciting to me, because it already works pretty well, and getting it to be more delightful seems like there's not too much distance from here to there. So I wonder if anyone else has like a closing.
Well, I'll take that one. Like for me, yeah, really taking the next steps with Ludos really is an important piece. And to the thing that Lucas was offering earlier, the game, the engine, not the game engine, the engine that it's based on, SYN, which is for real-time collaboration, that allows you to create things like Google Docs. It was just as good for creating where people can do things exactly at the same time. It's pretty close to real time. It's not 30 frames a second, but it works for small numbers of people. And I think doing some more things in that space, I'm gonna just throw some things together there. That's my next field in here. And like you say, it's having something that can be played with. I'm really actually kind of intrigued about this beauty thing. Like, what would be something that is co-creative visually, that could lead, that has like a simple contracted number of things that could be assembled together just for beauty? Like what? But there's a tension. I also with it, I don't know what that is, and I think that's where I want to explore as well, is really take to heart this notion of tension at the same time as pulling those together.
I'm inspired by that co-creator, that creator of our place, Reddit place, Josh Wardle, who also created Wordle, right? Both of those demonstrate that you can do things that are really simple that end up being really fun, and so that feels that type of constrained design of a social space for play or co-creation feels really exciting. And those are very different games, right? Like Our Place was fun because there was like a coordinated, like, international territory war for pixels on a screen, and Wordle is basically a game that you play by yourself. So yeah.
Well, actually, I gotta say, Wordle, I only play it because I play it with 4 other people. Every day we do the Wordle, and it's fun to see how much they got it in and we got it in. And Wordle has been written for Holochain. It works.
Yeah.
I mean, basically, it's just plugging somebody's open source Wordle implementation on top of a Holochain backend. Sorry, next person. Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate that.
Cool. Thank you all for being part of it.
Bye,
Thank
I also
Zippy.
gotta
Thank
go.
you.
Thank you so much, Hailey.
Thanks.
Bye,
Yeah.
Zippy.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks.